Hi, in today's video I'm going to be covering how you can use the Xdg specification to move a lot of your dot files out of your home into .config. So what are dot files? If you come across to your file manager, in this case the GNOME file manager, and press Ctrl H, that will show you all the hidden files that are called dot files. They're called dot files because the name is prefixed with a dot. So you see here we've got cache, config, dbus, local, a lot of other files down here. And I'm going to show you how you can remove a lot of these using the Xdg specification. Now if we come across to the Arch wiki, it's got a good page here, but unfortunately they've changed the theme on the Arch wiki to a mobile theme, which Brodie Robinson covered in a recent video. As a quick hack, what I recommend doing is if you use Firefox, just turn on reader view and you can get rid of that horrible theme. So this is the Xdg specification on the Arch wiki, and basically what it is you can set some variables in your shell config that will be used by programs, so that instead of installing things in your home directory, they'll be installed in .config or .cache or .local share. So what I'm going to do is actually cover some of the things that you can actually move. So firstly, I'm going to show you how to move Emacs into .config, where to put your fonts and icons. I can move Tmux, WeChat, DVD, CSS, wget, abook, several other files. And also, if you're on Ubuntu and have switched to using ZSH, how you can remove a lot of the bash files that will be pre-installed on Ubuntu, and what happens if you remove the .profile file. So what I'm going to do is come across to my notes here. So first thing that we want to do is actually edit our ZSH env file, and basically what we're doing in this is, first of all, we're going to set a path. This is where we set our path for our local bin, our home local bin or our home bin directory. So this is how you can append your directories to the path. And this -u option will make sure that the path is actually unique. So the next thing that we're going to come on to is how you set the Xdg directory. So we've got Xdg config home, which corresponds to home.config. Then we've got Xdg cache home, which is home.cache, and then home.local share. So what we do is we set those in our shell config, and what should happen is programs should then write their config to those locations. Now if you've already installed applications before you've set this, what you can actually do is move those directories out of your home folder into .config, and I'll show you that. So I'll go through these options that I've set here. So first one is for the SSH auth socket. So this is going to be set to Xdg runtime directory, which corresponds to something like run user something like I forget off the top of my head, but basically that moves the shush authentication socket out of your home directory. Now the other one I'm going to cover here is less. And there's two options for less. You've got the less history file and less key, and what you can do is move those to Xdg config home, so they'll be stored in less, so it'll be .config less. You can also do the same thing for wget. You can actually move a lot of the files created by wget into .config as well, but you also need to create a config file, and in that config file you specify a location for stuff. So if I just come across to .config wget, okay, so what we've got here is the hists file, and that's basically a history file. And what you actually have to do is in wget-rc, in .config wget-rc, you create a line of text like this, and you can't use environmental variables. You can't like use home. You've got to put in the full path. So home, your username, .cache, wget hist. So this is going to be the wget history file. So that's wget. Basically, that was in, if I come back up here, that was in .config wget-rc for the history file. I'll put links to all this under the video. And now the next thing I want to cover is libdvd css. And typically you'll get a .dvd css directory in your home folder, and this is usually created with programs like VLC or MPV that use this library to sort of play DVDs or videos. And again, you can move this file out of your home into .config dvd css. Another one you can actually move is the AWS CLI tool, which is a command line tool to Amazon services. And these are the options you can do. You can set the shared credential file and config file to .config AWS credentials or AWS config. So those are some of the options that you can actually go through. So what I'll do is I'll come across and let me bring up the terminal. So this is my home directory here, and you can see I've actually got a lot of files that I haven't actually been able to move because they're hard coded. Things like GNU GPG, Google Earth, Mozilla is another one. Also on Ubuntu, what you'll have is a file called sudo as admin successful, which you can't actually remove. It's created only on Ubuntu, and it's to do with the bash shell. And even if you switch to ZSH and you remove this file, it will always come back. So that's one you can't actually get rid of. Again, there's other older programs like W3M that you can't actually move, and ZSH creates a lot of files in your home directory, and there is a way to sort of set a z.dot directory, but I think what you end up having to do is you have to have a ZSH env file in your home directory that points to another ZSH env file that loads everything up, and it just seemed a bit of a hassle to do, and that's why I didn't do that. So these are some of the things that will crop up in your home directory. And as I said, normally what you'll do is put things like fonts in this here directory, like dot fonts or dot icons. You can move those files to another location. So I'll cover that. And also another one that's quite common is Emacs. Emacs will create a .emacs.d directory in your home folder, and typically you'll also have a .emacs configuration file. But if I come across to my .config file here, directory rather, what you'll see is I've moved a lot of these things out. So we've got a book, ARIA2, AWS. Again, here we've got Emacs in .config, DVD CSS. So there's a lot of programs that do respect the Xdg specification. We've got MPD, MPV, MUT, NCMPC. So these are a lot of files that can be moved, but one of the issues is you need the latest version of the application to be able to do this. So for instance, Tmux in the Ubuntu repository is still using your home directory, but if you upgrade to a newer version of Tmux, using something like Nyx PKGS, which I covered in a previous video, which will allow you to install the latest versions of software on your computer, even if you're running a long-term release. It won't interfere with stuff. You will be able to install the newer versions of programs that do respect the Xdg specification, and you'll be able to clean up your home directory. So what I'm going to do is come across to, let me come back to Emacs and my notes, Xdg. So that was going through the ZSH file where you can set your path, the Xdg directories, things like shush, less, wget, libd, lib, dvd, css. Oh shit. So what I'm going to do is come across and go through these different programs and how you can actually move them. Another thing that I want to cover is the xprofile. And you might not have heard of this file, and it's used with the GDM login manager, which only looks for a .profile or a .xprofile file. So if you switch to ZSH and you create a .zprofile file and you remove the old bash.profile file, what will happen is you won't be able to log in with GDM because it doesn't use a .zprofile file. So I'm going to cover that as well. So let's go through this list. So first of all, Emacs. So you need to be running, I believe it's 27.1 or above. And again, I use Nyx PKGS to install all my programs so that I have the latest versions. So the way this works is basically, first of all, we move the .emacs.d file to .config emacs. Then what you need to do is move your .emacs file. So you've got two things. You've got the .emacs.d directory in your home folder, and then you also have usually a .emacs file, which is the config file. And what you need to do is you need to move the .emacs file into .config emacs init.el. Now, after you've done that, what you might find is that you get an error message saying something out of it's out of date. Something's, it'll throw a sort of like little error. And what you need to do to fix this is run mx byte recompile directory, then press return, and go to .config emacs elper, and then press return. And what that's going to do is that's going to byte recompile everything in elper, which is where all the Emacs packages get stored. It's just going to make sure that they're being recompiled because you've moved the file. It has to sort of recompile them. So if you get that error, that's what you do. You run byte recompile directory on .config emacs elper. So again, only a couple of steps. We've moved the emacs.d to .config emacs, and then we moved the .emacs file to .config emacs init.el. Now, what I'm going to do is just come across to my Emacs config, because what happens is Emacs will never create the .config emacs directory. By default, it will always create a .emacs.d directory in your home folder. And I'll come across to init.el. What I found is, okay, this section here. Emacs will typically create backup and auto-save files, and they'll usually be in your Emacs directory, in your .config Emacs file. You'll have, if I come across Emacs here, you can see it's creating this auto-save list here, even though it's empty. But usually you'll get auto-save list and backup list, backups. And what I found is Emacs even if you set the Emacs to be in .config Emacs, what sometimes happens is that it will still create the .backup files in emacs.d. So what can happen is you move everything across into this config Emacs folder, and then what will happen is it will try and make a backup or an autosave, and it will recreate the emacs.d directory in your home folder to store these things in. Then what happens is you'll reboot into your computer, and what you'll find is Emacs will be blank. It will just come up like a fresh Emacs. And the reason for that is because Emacs has found this emacs.d directory in your home folder, which has been created with these backup files, and then uses that instead of the one in instead of .config Emacs. So you'll get like a splash screen in Emacs, with none of your extensions or anything installed, your plugins rather. So what I did was I set my temporary file directory where it basically creates backups and autosaves to temp. So doing this basically puts, if I come across here, okay, it hasn't actually got any in there, but they would actually be created in this temp directory. So instead of creating stuff in .emacs.d, what it will do is basically it will just put all your backups and everything in temp, which is also quite handy because I always find that you can set it to manually sort of clear stuff, but it just sort of clutters up your home. And the advantage of putting them into temp is when you reboot, they'll all be gone. So typically I don't really use backup files or autosave files that often. But if you do, you might, if you want to keep them, you could specify another directory, but I put them in temp. But I found that this stopped the .emacs.d directory being created. And now the other thing that you need to do is, what you have to do is specify the actual path of stuff. So in Emacs, you can have a Lisp directory where you install particular scripts. So if you're using that, you need to make sure you put it in the full path, like .config, Emacs, Lisp. Okay, and the other thing that you can do is actually set backups to exclude files that were created by sudo or doas. So if you're editing a password file or something, you probably don't want that backed up. So this is also a way to not back up files opened by sudo. So I just wanted to show you that in Emacs and some of the issues you might come across. Now the next one I want to do is come across to fonts. And typically what you'll do is you'll create a .fonts directory in your home folder. That's actually deprecated. And what you can do is move all those fonts into .local share fonts. What you'll also find is you'll have a .font config file in your home directory as well. You can actually remove that, and then when you recreate the font cache by running sort of sudo fc cache -f-v, that will recreate the font config file. I think it's in local share fonts somewhere, but it won't be recreated in your home directory. So again, move your fonts from .fonts to .local share fonts, remove the font config and recreate the cache. And if I come across to local share fonts, you can see this is where I've got all the fonts installed instead of .fonts. So that's how you can move your fonts. The next one is icons. So typically if you manually install icon sets, you'd put them in .icons. What you can actually do is move those to .local share icons instead. And then after you've done that, what you actually need to do is update the icon cache. So I come across up here, so we got .local share icons. You can see I've got Papyrus and Papyrus Dark in here. So those were originally in .icons, and I've moved them to .local share icons. And right, okay, and then what we have to do is run gtk -update -icon -cache -f-t, and then the full path to the icon theme. So that'd be local share icons Papyrus or local share icons Papyrus Dark. You need to do that for each one of the icon sets that you've moved. So that's the icons. Next one I'm going to cover is Tmux, and you need to be running a the latest version of Tmux to do this. The version in the Ubuntu repository won't pick up the .config Tmux directory. So again, I'd recommend using Nyx pkgs, which is a package manager that I covered in a previous video that basically had advanced features like rollbacks, so you can actually roll back to previous versions. It installs stuff in a completely separate directory from your system, and it's really good. So if you want to do all this, I'd have a look at that, because that will allow you to get the latest version of the programs. So for Tmux, what we're going to do is create a .config Tmux directory, and then we can move our .tmux.config file into .config tmux.config. So again, Tmux by default is going to be .tmux.config in your home directory. So what you can do is, as I said, create the .config Tmux directory, and then move the .tmux.config file into tmux.config. So the naming convention usually with these things is when they're in your home directory, they begin with a dot. They're preceded by a dot. When you put them in the Xdg directories, they don't have a dot prefix to the file name. So that's Tmux. Next one is WeChat. Again, you're going to need a latest version of WeChat for this, but you can create a WeChat directory in .config, and then basically just move your .WeChat file into .config WeChat. Actually, you don't need to create the directory in this case, so because in some cases you need to create the directory and move a file. In this case, we don't actually need to do that. So because we're just moving this, we can just move .WeChat to .config WeChat, and that will basically move WeChat from your home directory into .config. The next one is DVD CSS. So again, this works with the option here. So you need to set this option in your DSH env file. Export DVD CSS underscore cache equals xdg data home DVD CSS. So this one, again, we can just move .dvd CSS to .config DVD CSS, and that takes care of that. The next one is for Amazon command line tool, and you can basically move the .aws directory into .config AWS. And again, you need to actually set the environmental variables for that here, with export AWS shared credentials file and AWS config file. And you put in the full paths here. You can see AWS credentials or AWS config. And that's just a command line tool that works with Amazon buckets, basically. Next one is wget, which I showed you. We have to move the .wget host to cache wget hosts, and then you edit your ZSH environmental file, and you add this code here, export wget rc, like this. And in that wget rc file, as I showed you, wget rc, what you actually have to do is put in the full path there. You can't put in $home. You got to put in the full path: home, your username, .cache, wget-host, wget-hsts, and that's basically the history file. So that's wget. You can also move a book, which is a command line address book. And basically what you do is you move, you create a .config abook directory, and what you need to do is create an alias for abook. So you basically say abook equals abook -- data file. Oh, where is it gone? Xdg config home abook address book. Okay, so that's abook. And again, these are all in the ArchWiki Xdg base directory. And this is basically explaining the user directories: Xdg config home, cache, data. If I scroll down further here, what you'll see is there's a couple of tables showing supported applications and applications that don't fully support Xdg, but that you can sort of trick. So we've got stuff like ALSA, ARIA2. Let's say here's Emacs. You've got fish, font config. So this is the font config and .fonts files I mentioned. And a lot of these programs will actually pick things up automatically. So if you set your Xdg directories and you install new applications, they should pick up the .config file, .config directory, and install things there. If you have existing applications installed, you'll actually manually need to move them. So this is the table showing sort of supported applications. So we can see MPD, MPZ, MPV, MUT, Nano. And if I scroll down further, you see we've got TIG here, Tmux. And now these are partially supported applications like abook, as I showed you. So these are the partially supported applications. Now I'm just going to come back here and mention bash file. So on Ubuntu, bash is the default shell. So if I just come across here, okay, so by default on Ubuntu, what you'll have is these 4 files here: bash history, bash logout, bash rc, and .profile. So if you've switched to the ZSH shell, you don't need these files anymore in your home directory. But there's an issue, and this one here, .profile. If you remove the .profile file and you're using the GDM login manager, and you're using something other than GNOME, like for instance I'm using Xmonad, what will happen is you won't be able to log in. The GDM login manager specifically looks for files called either .profile, which is a bash file, or .xprofile. So if you remove the .profile file, basically GDM will stop working and it won't let you boot into your desktop if it's something other than GNOME. So what the solution is, I come across here. is, as I said, you can remove these files. You can move all these files. And what I did was created a directory on the desktop called ubuntu-bash, just to back these up. So what you do is, once you've done that, you can then move the .bashrc, .bashhistory, .bashlogout, and .profile into that backup directory. But after you've done that, what you'll need to do is create a .xprofile file. And I've got some notes here. The GDM login manager requires a file called profile or xprofile to work, and it won't pick up a .zprofile file. So if you're using ZSH and you have a .zprofile file, the GDM manager, login manager, won't use that file. So what we need to do is create a file called .xprofile. And in the example below, what I have is a path to my .local bin directory, which is where xmonad, my window manager's installed. And this section here is added by the Nyx Installer, which is a package manager that I've mentioned a couple of times, which actually installs stuff in .nyx pkgs/bin for binaries. And so this one is just specific to me, this Nyx one. But basically what you usually need to do is set the path in the .xprofile file. And once you've done that, GDM will pick that up and you'll actually be able to log in. So again, if you remove the .profile file, GDM will stop working and you won't be able to log into your window manager. So again, what you need to do is create the .xprofile file and basically just add your path. So as I said, most window managers and things, you know, will install stuff in .local bin or something like that. So you need to actually set the path to where your window manager's installed in this .xprofile file. So that's just some notes on how you can clean stuff up. And this is the Arch Wiki page. And as you can see here, they've absolutely butchered the wiki. Usually the Arch Wiki is a great place to go, but this is awful. They've just got this awful mobile theme that's sort of straight out of the 90s with these big white spaces here. Apparently there is some way you can manipulate the URL to restore the old theme, but the quickest way is basically to use reader mode here, and that just makes it a lot easier to read. So this basically covers setting the Xdg config home, the cache home, data home, the runtime directory, and then we have a list of supported applications here. And these are partially supported applications, and then at the bottom I think there's a list of things that aren't supported at all, I think. Yeah, hard-coded. So these are applications that are got a hard-coded path. So this will be things like, as you can see here, Bash. Apparently there's some things you can do with Bash, but since I don't use Bash, you can just remove them. There's other things like Firefox. The traditional deb version will create a .mozilla file in your home. Flatpak creates a .var. There's Gramps, which is a genealogy program for you know, family trees. That's going to be in .gramps. And there's things like Google Earth, Kodi, which is a media player. So there's a lot of apps that don't actually sort of respect the Xdg specifications and will be hard coded, and there's not much you can do about them. But if I come across my home directory here, as you can see, I've still got a lot of stuff here. We've got X authority, X resources, which is a config file for urxvt terminal, and it's also where I set options for Emacs. We've got the .cache.config dbus. I'm not sure if you can move that. GHC is Haskell, I think it is. And yeah, GNU-PG keys, that's hard-coded. And again, Google Earth, Gramps, .local, which is an Xdg Directory, Mozilla, and I'm using Nyx PKG, so they create these couple of directories here. These NV, that is CUDA, and these NVIDIA, because I've got an NVIDIA card. .pkgi, I believe, is to do with the GNOME keyring. So you typically have a program called passwords built into GNOME that sort of stores your sort of credentials for ZSA, SSH and GPG keys, and sort of stuff like Chromium or other things that sort of save passwords, and it creates this .pki file. Another one that's hard-coded is SSH. And then we got stack, and that's basically because I compiled xmonad from source. I think you can actually move stack and GHC, but I haven't. And again, this sudo as admin successful, this is particular to Ubuntu, and it's to it actually works with bash, and it's to suppress a warning that you get in bash. And even if you switch shell to ZSH, it still recreates this file even if you remove it. TIG history, there was supposed to be a way to actually move this file, but it actually sort of recreates itself. Another one is, this is the urxvt terminal socket file, and although you're supposed to be able to specify another location for that, I found that it keeps coming back, and that might be because I've got a older version of urxvt. Again, W3M is a command line web browser, and again, that's hard coded and you can't move that. XKB, that is something I've set up, and that's basically for swapping my keys, sort of swapping the keyboard layout a bit, remapping keys. And again, this xprofile file here, this is required if you're using the GDM login manager. And again, that basically here, in that I just basically set a path to my local bin directory. So that is instead of the .profile file. So again, with GDM, it either looks for .profile file, which is a bash config file, or a .xprofile file. So I've switched to ZSH as my shell, so there's no point in having a .profile file for bash in there. But the funny thing is, if you have the .profile file there, which is a bash file, and you're using ZSH, the GDM login manager will pick up the .profile file and then log you into your window manager. But as I said, I'm not using bash, so that's why instead of the .profile file, I use a .xprofile file and just put in the path to the location of my xmonad binary. And then here we've got these files that are created by ZSH. And apparently there is a way to move these into sort of like .config ZSH, but the issue is you still need to have a .zsh env file in your home directory that points to another .zsh file in .config zsh that then sort of sources everything, and it just seemed like you know, a bit silly having two zsh env files. Although I think you can set this, you can edit the system install of ZSH and set a .z, I think it's a z dot directory or something. But that basically requires you to edit, I think it's like etc ZSS, ZSH, ZSHRC or something. So I didn't bother with that one. So these are, that's my cleaned up home directory. And again, config. So we've got a lot of stuff in here. Little GIMP, ARIA2C, AWS. We've got BAT, which is a improved version of CAT. We've got Dunst for notifications. We've got Emacs, which is a big one to move. We've got Git in there, so you can have Git installed, your Git configuration in there. MPD, MPV, MUT, NCMPC, Newsboat, NNN, Rofi, Surferall, SX, HKD, which is a keyboard daemon, TIG, which is a sort of N-cursors interface to Git. Tint2 is the panel. We've got Tmux, we've got Transmission, which is a BitTorrent client. URL scan, which is a program that scans input for URLs. We've got URXVT, which is my terminal. VLC, WeChat, wget, Xmonad. We've got things like, you know, YTDLP, YTFCF, and Zathora, which is a command line PDF viewer. So that's how you can move a lot of stuff into your .config directory, and also into your local share. So local share, for instance, fonts or icons. So that's basically the Xdg specification on the Arch Wiki. And if you follow along on this page, again, it will show you all the supported applications. Then the I scroll down, the partially supported applications. So in the left-hand column here, basically, it's going to give you the directory and then where you can move it to. So have a look at this file and then this page, and you can just follow along and move a lot of the stuff out of your home directory.